Number 10. Miles Morales. In Marvel's infamous Ultimate Universe, when the original Spider-Man, Peter Parker, was killed by his universe's Sinister Six, the entire city of New York mourned the young hero, with practically half the city showing up to his funeral. Even though they had called him a menace for most of his short career, he was finally embraced as a hero and treated with the respect he deserved by both the city and the heroes who had looked down on him due to his age. So, when a new Spider-Man showed up in Ultimate Fallout number 4, both the villains and the heroes he came across were kinda weirded out and took the time to tell him that dressing as the recently dead hero was in terrible taste. Miles Morales of course became a fan favorite character and was eventually transferred to the main 616 Marvel universe, but it's interesting that until he was able to prove himself in story, many of the other characters thought of him as a disrespectful knockoff. Of course, now he is considered by characters and fans alike more as an official franchisee, having the approval of the original Spider-Man. Number 9. Scorpion. When J. Jonah Jameson hired a private investigator named Mac Gargan to follow Peter Parker to find out how he got such incredible photos of Spider-Man, Peter was able to easily avoid him thanks to his spider sense. Frustrated at how Spider-Man was beginning to be embraced by the public, JJ decided to create a bug-themed superperson of his own. He hired a scientist who specialized in mutating animals and paid Gargan $10,000 to undergo experiments that would give him scorpion powers. He also had a scorpion-themed costume made up, complete with a dangerous tail for Mac to wear, and then he sent him after Spider-Man. The experiment unfortunately drove Mac insane, and he became a supervillain, but the fact that he was created to essentially be a Jameson-approved version of the webbed wall crawler is an interesting bit of backstory. Number 8. Deadpool. Deadpool is actually more of a Deathstroke ripoff than he is a Spider-Man one. Deathstroke is a super deadly assassin named Slade Wilson who uses a combination of firearms and swords to defeat his enemies, and Deadpool is a super deadly assassin named Wade Wilson who uses a combination of firearms and swords to defeat his enemies. Sure, Deadpool is quippy in a way that's not dissimilar to the webbed wall crawler, but the aspect we're focusing on is his look. Deadpool wears a distinctive red bodysuit with white eyes and honestly doesn't look that much like Spider-Man. However, it is enough of a passing resemblance that it has become a running gag in the comics for characters to mistake Deadpool for Spidey. This is usually done to be a blow to Deadpool's confidence and sense of identity, and even more often as a joke where Deadpool does something absolutely horrible, inadvertently getting the crime pinned on Spider-Man, further damaging his notoriously constantly tarnished reputation. Okay, that's the last of the characters who ever cross paths with Spider-Man. Let's move on to the characters that borrow from the character a bit more liberally, with most of them copying either his look, his powers, his bug theme, or the revolutionary teenage Superman aspect that Spider-Man started. Number 7. Sailor Moon. Before Spider-Man, the common thought process among writers was that teenagers could not be superheroes, only sidekicks. That's part of what made Spider-Man so revolutionary, as in the early comics we got to see him balancing his high school life with the responsibilities of being a hero. It was such an iconic element that even though Spider-Man was actually only in high school for the first 28 issues of his series, he is still mostly thought of as a teenage superhero. This element was used for lots of heroes across different media, but let's go with Sailor Moon, so we can dip our toes in the manga world for a bit. Usagi Tsukino was a regular high school girl before she met a talking black cat named Luna, who told her that she was really one of the Sailor Senshi of love and justice, Sailor Moon. She spends a lot of her run having to balance the typical issues of teenagehood, like school and romance, with saving the world from evil beings. Not one of the most obvious imitators of old Webhead, but it's a fun example of him having an influence beyond just a Western audience. Number 6. Batman Beyond. When the Batman animated series came to an end, its creators followed it up with another banger called The New Batman Adventures, which continued the adventures of the great Kevin Conroy's Batman while introducing the other members of the Bat family. It was extremely well received, but the network made the surprising choice to cancel it after one season. Their reasoning was that shows featuring teenagers such as Buffy the Vampire Slayer were doing really well, and they wanted a new Batman show featuring a teenage Batman to try and capture some of that audience. audience. Not wanting to mess with their established continuity, the producers pitched the idea of the series taking place in the future, with Bruce Wayne passing down the mantle. They got the green light from the network, but none of the writers really wanted to do the show until they realized that it would allow them to, quote, do all that Spider-Man stuff, with the tortured hero trying to balance their life as a superhero with their personal and school life. This idea got them excited, and the resulting show, featuring Terry McGinnis becoming the new Dark Knight, was a worthy and iconic addition to the Batman mythos, receiving 3 full seasons as well as a feature film, before eventually being incorporated into the comic books. Due to the talents of all those involved, Batman Beyond is able to stand on his own 2 feet as a hero, but it's interesting that it was the influence not of the original Batman, but of Spider-Man that got the writers started. Number 5. Sideways. Sideways is a DC Comics character who was caught in an earthquake when Challenger's Mountain came back from the dark multiverse. He fell into a chasm in the ground and through a rift, which led to the dark multiverse. This gave him the ability to teleport through dimensions, as well as super strength, agility, and reflexes. Like Spider-Man, he is a teenage hero trying to balance the various aspects of his life, but the more significant influence is clearly his costume, with the mouthless mask and shape of the large eyes. As Bully Maguire put it in Spider-Man 3, it looks very, similar. Number 4. Bug. Next up, we have our first Spider-Man inspired villain of the list. Bug is a little-known DC villain who operates out of Gotham City, having his first major appearance in Batman Family number 3. Bug is a villain who specializes in surveillance, using a special suit that allows him to stick to walls. The mask is very Spider-Man-esque, and the whole sticking to walls thing while operating with a bug theme makes Spidey's influence pretty obvious. Although this character is way less known than the Marvel original, and seems more like a off-brand dollar store action figure your grandma would buy you by mistake. Number 3. Haunt. When Secret Agent Kurt Kilgore was killed by rival agents, his spirit sought out his brother, a flawed and bitter priest named Daniel, in order to try and protect his newly widowed wife from the agents who had taken his life. When the agents attacked Daniel, Kurt's ghost merged with him and Daniel became Haunt, a brutal and violent superhero with razor-sharp claws, super strength, and speed, as well as the ability to manipulate his ghostly ectoplasm, forming it into weapons, cobwebs, and tentacles. Haunt was created by superstar comic book creators Todd McFarlane and Robert Kirkman, and is a part of the Spawn universe featured in Image Comics. While story-wise and personality-wise, Haunt is very different from Spider-Man, his costume and tendency to be drawn surrounded by cobwebs makes me think Todd McFarlane missed drawing Spider-Man when he created him. Number 2. Dragonfly. Transitioning away from characters who are influenced by or simply copies of Spidey, let's talk about one that's straight up parody. During that weird period in the 2000s when we were constantly getting spoof films like Scary Movie, Epic Movie, and Meet the Spartans, one of the better entries in the series was Superhero Movie. It made fun of superhero movies from the early 2000s like the X-Men trilogy, Fantastic Four, and Batman Begins, but its main source of inspiration was clearly the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, with its lead character, Rick, being bitten by a genetically enhanced super dragonfly and becoming a bug-themed superhero. The movie is borrowing heavily from the visual style of the Raimi films and lifts several moments almost directly from the first Spider-Man movie with a comedic twist, such as Rick getting a job taking photos of the dragonfly, having his identity discovered at a Thanksgiving dinner by the villain, and tragically losing his uncle, who is played by Leslie Nielsen of Naked Gun and Airplane fame. Like most of the parody films of the era, it wasn't well received when it came out, and a lot of the jokes haven't aged well, but the film is definitely at its best when it's riffing on the classic elements of the Spider-Man story rather than making pop culture references that have aged like a fine milk. Number 1. Black Spider. Eric Needham was an addict who accidentally killed his dad while robbing a liquor store. He felt remorse for this and began hunting down and killing the various dealers in Gotham City. A wealthy benefactor gave him an advanced costume and weapons to help him in his goal, but it turned out to be a rival criminal just trying to get rid of his competition. Black Spider's lethal approach brought him into conflict with Batman, and after being defeated, Black Spider began teaming up with criminals, being more interested in revenge against the Dark Knight than fighting crime anymore. The character obviously has a similar costume, and choosing to make a character in comic books spider-themed is begging for comparisons to Spider-Man. But his knockoff status was pushed to the limit when he was introduced in the Young Justice animated series, where he was full-on web-slinging and being voiced by the spectacular Spider-Man voice actor Josh Keaton.
Number 10. Plutonian. The Plutonian hails from the Mark Waid series Irredeemable and its spin-off series Incorruptible, both published by Boom Studios. In this series, we get to imagine what a Superman character would be like if he wasn't driven by hope and kindness, but instead driven by a sense of entitlement and rage? Daniel Hartigan was once a hero who did his best to earn the respect and love of the people of Earth, but has turned hard over the years, in part by the loss he himself has suffered, but also by the fact that he feels in essence betrayed by humanity, who he sees as lesser than him, and who he grows to despise for critiquing his failings. And friends, before I move on to our next spot on this list, wait! Hold on a second! Are you subscribed yet? Because I think many of you are not, so you should click that subscribe button now, or else something bad will happen. Or maybe not, but you'll feel better if you click it, I promise. Yeah, see, don't you feel better now? Number 9. Samaritan. Samaritan is like a less fun, more stoic Superman. I mean, even his name sounds more stoic. Samaritan. He's a hero in the Astro City series. This series started out with Image, got passed around a bunch to other publishers, including DC themselves, with their now defunct line, Vertigo, before returning home to Image once more, recently, in 2022, as a matter of fact. Instead of being an alien from another world, Samaritan is a no-nonsense time traveler, whose power set and appearance echo Kal-El's, despite having a very different personality. Number 8. Miracle Man. Miracle Man. Oh boy. Miracle Man started as more of a Superman mimic for sure, but how he has evolved as a character since then. He was originally known as Marvel Man, and was a superhero who hailed from L. Miller and Son Limited's comics. This was back in the 1950s, and they definitely got some inspiration from the Superman trope for sure. Although really this is a character inspired by another likely Superman-inspired creation, Captain Marvel. At least a lot of people tend to draw parallels between Supes and Captain Marvel, who we now know as Shazam, and honestly, there's a lot of stuff to base that off of, but maybe we'll talk about that later. In the late 1980s, Marvel Man was rebooted by Alan Moore and given a much more darker origin, especially in relation to one of his family members and his story, Kid Miracle Man, aka Johnny Bates. After much legal proceedings in regards to who actually owned the rights to Miracle Man, Marvel ended up acquiring them and getting Neil Gaiman to return to conclude that story that he had written for the character back in the late 80s and the early 90s, following Moore's time writing for the character. And that actually also all spun out of a whole legal proceeding that Neil Gaiman was doing with Todd McFarlane, and then Marvel was just like swooped in and bought those rights. But they were like, hey Neil, you can come write it. Number 7. Sentry. Sentry himself is like Superman, but if you made him really depressing. Well, maybe not quite as depressing as Miracle Man can be at times, but yes. Sentry is like Marvel's Superman. In fact, I'd argue he is one of the most iconic of their Superman-esque characters. This is probably true because his story is quite different from the original Kal-El, which is what makes him stand out a lot more. He's got actually a really good story. Bob Reynolds was not an alien, but instead was an addict desperate for a hit. So he broke into a lab and ended up stumbling upon and consuming the Golden Sentry formula. What is the Golden Sentry formula? That formula was actually made in an attempt to recreate the Super Soldier Serum, but also make it thousands of times more powerful, because why wouldn't you do that? As it stands, when Bob became Sentry, it is said that he had the power of 1,000,000 exploding suns. That's like Superman times 1,000,000 and exploding, I guess. Sentry also is known for his darker reflection, the Void, which initially was believed to be the result of a dissociative identity disorder, which we later learned was actually created by the villain Mastermind, who made Sentry believe that basically the Sentry couldn't exist without the Void also existing. For a while, the world forgot Sentry, us readers included, until he was retconned into existence in the early 2000s. But you know, retcon isn't like, he's always been around, you just forgot. Recently, Sentry was torn asunder in King in Black. Karma really for all the people Sentry is torn in half himself. That is a thing he does a lot. He died and was taken to Valhalla by Valkyrie Jane Foster, but now he's kind of back as a zombie, with his body supposedly possessed by 100 million crazed ghosties, or something like that. Comics. 100 million seems to be a number that Sentry just, it's like, you know, he's always 100 million something. Number 6. Gladiator. Gladiator belongs to an alien race, which is where he gets his powers from. His given name is Calark, and he is from Stronia. As a Stronian, he has certain powers thanks to his alien physiology, but he was also enhanced to become a gladiator, and was one of the few who proved themselves worthy enough to earn a place on the Shi'ar Imperial Guard. His power set is quite similar to Superman's, and includes super speed, strength, heat vision, super hearing, a healing factor, strong psychic defense, and even a kind of Bizarro-esque power, Frost Breath. Gladiator can also travel without protection in the vacuum of space like Superman can. However, where he is somewhat unique is in how his powers work. Gladiator's base is pretty powerful, but he actually has the potential to even surpass the power levels of someone like Superman, if he is confident enough. See, the more he believes in himself, the more powerful he becomes. Number 5. Icon. Now, you may have noticed, I'm not really using the term knockoff when I'm talking about these heroes on this list, despite the fact that that is the title for the video, and that's because while they're definitely startlingly similar to Superman, I think a lot of them bring something new to the table. Icon himself is from Milestone Media, but at the same time DC Comics was kind of the one working with Milestone in distribution, and even recently both incorporated some of Milestone's characters into their continuity, and then later revived Milestone, giving their heroes a reboot and their own line. Icon himself is similar to Superman in the sense that they are both insanely powerful aliens from another world. But while Superman was quick to step up to the plate and become a hero, Augustus Freeman eventually became a recluse who had to be drawn out into the light and convinced to become a hero, which is where his spunky sidekick Rocket came in, who not only motivated Freeman to become the hero Icon, but also persuaded him to let her join him, despite her not possessing powers of her own. How cool is that? Honestly, I think Icon's like a cooler Superman. He also just has a cool story where like he landed and then, you know, because of the way he was found, that shaped who he became as a humanoid figure. So neat. Number 4. Captain Marvel. I mean, you can't have a list where we discuss characters seemingly inspired by, or who somehow just so happen to resemble Superman, without talking about one of the most famous among them. That's right, we're talking about Captain Marvel, or as he's known now, Shazam. Still, I'm sticking with his classic name for the title at this point because that's how we knew him originally in the comics when we first were introduced to this character. Captain Marvel appeared shortly after Superman hit the scene, making his debut in 1939 in Fawcett Comics. Although he's with DC now, back then, he was not. Famously, DC Comics sued Fawcett Comics for copyright infringement in 1941, after things came to a boiling point between the two companies, with DC, or National Comics Publications as they were known at the time, believing that Captain Marvel was just another copycat superhero of their own Superman. Well, you might know that DC lost this trial, which also went on for like 12 years. This is a really long trial. What you might not know is that the court actually agreed with DC, confirming that yes, Captain Marvel seemed to be a copy of Superman himself. However, because of a technicality where the copyright symbol was not placed on all of the Superman comic strips from National Comics, they lost the case, as it was determined that National Comics actually therefore had no copyright to sue over. Gotta make sure you put those symbols. Number 3. Apollo. Originally from Jim Lee's own company, Wildstorm Production, Wildstorm and Apollo have since been bought by DC, where Wildstorm first became an imprint before being blended in with the main continuity and line. Apollo himself is super similar to Superman, despite having completely different physical appearances and primary colors. Apollo 2 is a superhero who gets his power from the sun. Like Superman, he also has a sigil on his chest, though this represents not his house, but, you know, the sun itself, which as we said, gives him his power. So it makes sense. Apollo's power set includes many powers that are similar to Superman's as well, such as flight, super strength, heat vision, and durability. Apollo himself is immortal, but in addition to everything else, he has also been known to demonstrate the ability to manipulate matter on a molecular level, which is kind of different. Apollo is also married to Midnighter. Together they are like the sun and the moon, and allow shippers of Superman and Batman a glimpse into what that relationship might actually look like if the two were gay and attracted to one another and then ended up getting married. So for shippers of Supes and Bats, this might be a character for you. Number 2. Hyperion. I mean, this is literally a ripoff of Superman. That's kind of the whole point of the character though. He is meant to provide a commentary on Superman, which is why he exists as he does. The whole point of him is really his similarity and also his subtle differences to Supes. Hyperion hails from Marvel Comics and is often part of a team called the Squadron Supreme, or depending on the version that we're talking about, sometimes even the Squadron Supreme of America. Now, I don't know about you, but to me that definitely feels very similar to the Justice League, or the Justice League of America? Hyperion is known as Marcus Milton. Typically, his origin is that he was an alien who was sent to Earth as a baby, even more familiar, and not only that, but Hyperion, who can fly, is super strong, and super durable, was also apparently the last known survivor of an eternal alien race whose planet died. I mean, come on! This has Superman written all over it. He became one of his Earth's premier superheroes and ended up joining the Squadron Supreme. At least, you know, that's one of his main origin stories. There's a few different versions of Hyperion throughout Marvel Comics. Number 1. Homelander. Talk about commentaries on Superman. Homelander is also definitely that, but a much more crass commentary. This version of Superman is not really a hero, but instead is poised in Garth Ennis's comic series The Boys as the main antagonist. Although in reality, there are some bigger bads than him really, but still, in general, he is known to be one of the most vile and most powerful of the supes in the comic. The Boys imagines a harsh, brutal world that offers what it suggests is a more realistic take on what superpowered humans would be like, basically the actual worst. These heroes pretend to save the day, putting on big smiles, while really many of them are addicts, murderers, and often worse criminals than those they fight against, because they have superpowers. Homelander can fly, is invulnerable, insanely strong and fast, and has his own version of heat vision. He is also the leader of the Seven, the premier superhero team from Vought, the company that created superheroes and also works to make money off their brands, marketing them as being saviors and profiting for it, while covering up all the awful things they do to preserve and of course safeguard those profits. Because that's what it would be like if we had superheroes and they were brands in real life. I love talking about characters, their history outside of the panels, and their connection to those who have come before and inspired them. So thank you so much for watching.
And at number 10 is Popclaw. The Boys television show and the comics that inspired it are filled with characters that are meant to stand in for more well-known and beloved superheroes in an effort to tell a story about what superpowered beings might be like in the real world. Homelander is obviously meant to be Superman. The Deep is clearly a play on Aquaman, and Queen Maeve is very much Wonder Woman. One of the more minor characters to appear in both the comics and the TV show is Popclaw. Popclaw is a woman whose name is rather self-explanatory. She has claws that pop out of her arms with which she attacks her enemies. She's less one-to-one with Wolverine than other characters in the franchise are with their heroes that inspired them, but the influence is clearly there in aesthetic if nothing else. More comic-savvy fans will probably say she is more similar to X-23, and the creator of the character, Garth Ennis, has said that she is actually inspired more by Scandal Savage, but for the more casual viewer of the TV show, the first thought that will pop in their mind when they see Popclaw and her powers will be, oh, it's Wolverine. So for that reason, she will get the number 10 slot on this list. But in at number 9 is Seahawk. This character from Image Comics is really Mark Barrows, who was hunting for underwater artifacts with his family when one of the artifacts blew up, resulting in his father's death, but him and his brother being granted superpowers and becoming the heroes Seahawk and Cold Snap. He would go on to join the superhero team The Brigade, and overall isn't that much of a Wolverine knockoff. However, the fact that one of the powers granted to him was accelerated healing, and the fact that his look is kinda Logan-esque with the fangs and the pointy-eared mask makes me think that Wolverine was at least an influence on the character, and makes me comfortable putting him on the low end of this list. Number 8. Warblade. Warblade is an often forgot character that was created by Jim Lee and Brandon Choi for the DC Comics Wildstorm universe. Similar to what happened with Wolverine, Warblade was kidnapped and brainwashed so that he would be a member of an elite strike team known as the SHOC before breaking free of their control and joining a super team known as the Wildcats. Unlike Wolverine, he is not human and instead a Karen, an alien race who can shapeshift into a mercury-like substance. He can use this metal morphing ability to create claws, which he of course uses to attack his enemies. He is also a world-class martial artist with ties to Japan, but though he is clearly inspired by Wolverine, he is different enough to rank pretty low on this list as well. Number 7. Lobo. Lobo is a really interesting character as he was originally created as a joke. He was meant to be a parody of the gritty anti-heroes who were becoming so popular in the 90s by being a ridiculously buff space bounty hunter who would say goofy tough stuff, and it was just meant to be a big old goofy joke. One of the characters who was a main source of inspiration, according to one of its creators, Roger Slipher, was Wolverine, with his tendency to drink beer, constantly talk about how edgy and tough he was, and always talking about how he was the best there is at what he does. And what he does isn't very nice. Lobo also has a powerful healing factor, but that's neither here nor there. What the creators at DC Comics didn't anticipate was that the readers wouldn't take the character as a joke and would genuinely love the main man. Not once to look a gift horse in the mouth, DC quickly expanded the character to give him his own identity and gave him his own series of books. Number 6. Wild Child. First appearing in Alpha Flight number 1, Wild Child was created by John Byrne to be little more than a Wolverine-like character. Like Wolverine and Sabretooth, who isn't on this list as he was created to be a foil to Wolverine as opposed to a copy, Kyle Gibney has an animalistic nature as well as a healing factor and razor-sharp claws. Due to his freakish appearance, he was shunned by humanity until he was found by Department H, who made him a member of the Alpha Flight training program, Gamma Flight. When Alpha Flight had its funding pulled by the government and went independent, members of Beta and Gamma Flight were recruited by the evil Jerome Jackson to be members of the evil Omega Flight, who tried to defeat Alpha on 2 separate occasions in John Byrne's original run of the comics. When John Byrne left the book to work on the Incredible Hulk series, Wild Child was just a Wolverine-esque villain who had never really been an issue for the Alphas to defeat, but he was further developed by subsequent writers to be a more unique character, eventually joining the hero team and becoming Weapon Omega and dating fellow teammate Aurora. His morality has shifted quite a bit over the years, with him being a member of the Hellions, X-Factor, Weapon X, and becoming a good foil for Wolverine to fight rather than a throwaway copy he was originally intended to be. Number 5. Killraiser. Honestly, I feel like the motto of Image Comics in the 90s for the most part was, what if we took this character and then made them extreme? I mean, Spawn is undeniably cool and original as a character, but a lot of the characters sometimes feel like everything that was whack about comics in the 90s and turned to 11. Look at Killraiser for instance. He is a mute character who has sharp claws that come out of his gauntlets that he uses to fight and brutally tear to shreds his enemies, but then they took it the extra mile. This is how I think the pitch meeting went for this character. Dude, what if Wolverine had more claws? You mean, dude, like claws that come out of his feet as well? Nah, dude, what if Wolverine was just claws? Dude, what do you mean? I mean, what if he was mute so we never had to develop him as a character, and instead of being a dude that just has claws, he was just a dude made of claws, coming out of every part of his body? Dude, that's awesome. Number 4. Panther. In one of the more brazen acts of copying the editor of New Titans in the 90s, Jonathan Tierson wanted to make the Titans more like the X-Men. Rather than taking, say, the element of using a superhero story as a metaphor for prejudice or introducing the more convoluted relationships between characters of the universe to tell long, overarching stories, they decided to take this not literally and make some characters that were more like popular characters from the Marvel team, one of which was Rosabelle Mendez. Otherwise known as Panther or X-24, was a woman with cat-like abilities and claws who had a mysterious past she knew next to nothing about. She was subjected to experiments that granted her abilities, and she had to control her animal-like rage lest she lose control and scratch up everyone around her. Beyond that, the blue and yellow bodysuit with a yellow animal-like mask makes Panther a pretty clear Wolverine ripoff. Of course, with the designation X-24, you might be forgiven for assuming she was a ripoff of Marvel's Laura Kinney, otherwise known as X-23, but Panther does actually predate her by over a decade, with Panther first appearing in the early 1991 and X-23 first appearing in late 2003. Number 3. Wolveroach. Cerebus was a comic book series that starred an aardvark named Cerebus, who works as a barbarian. The series was originally intended to be a parody of Marvel's take on the Conan the Barbarian series, but over time became an odd hodgepodge of experimental explorations of religion, gender, and politics. It had a large cast of characters, many of whom were clear parodies of iconic superheroes, but one of the more egregious ones was the Cockroach, who over the course of the story took on various superhero identities such as Moon Roach, Punisher Roach. However, the one that got the most attention was Wolveroach. As you can see, he was basically just Wolverine. The character's role in the story was to be a character who had an almost religious fervor about him, intended to parody the oversaturation of Wolverine in the comics at the time. As Dave Sim put it himself in an interview for Comics Journal in 1996, when it came time to do a Roach character that had the ambience of religious fervor surrounding him, it had to be Wolverine. The fact that Marvel got so upset about me putting Wolverine on the successive covers, it's not a parody, you are now stealing the central icon of our church. Well, there you go, yes, I picked the right one. I didn't realize I was going to be putting my foot in this badly. I thought parody's parody, but you can take the chalice they called Captain America and do a parody of that. You can take the subaltern and do Moon Knight, but by God, don't you touch our Wolverine. That's the center of our church. As you can tell, Dave had very strong feelings about how popular Wolverine was and seems to also be kind of a weird dude. Number 2, Ripclaw. Cyberforce was originally intended to be a spin-off series of X-Men and X-Force, before eventually ending up at Image Comics rather than Marvel. It makes sense that a few of the characters would bear some similarities to members of the various mutant teams. The character that clearly riffs on Wolverine is Ripclaw. Actually, a good rule of thumb, if a character has the word claw in his name, there's a 70% chance that they are a Wolverine knockoff, as you can tell from all the other parts on this list. Ripclaw got his abilities after the spirits of his ancestors left him the mystical power to take on animal-like abilities, which is nice for him. I mean, all I got from my ancestors was the ability to burn in the sun and a history of heart disease. Ripclaw was then captured by the evil Cyber Data Corporation, who brainwashed him and gave him cybernetic enhancements such as razor-sharp claws. He has a tendency to snap into an animal-like rage, and he has also got a healing factor. Wolverine. He's basically Wolverine. But in at number 1 is Deadlock. Another Image Comics character, John Locke was an ordinary lowlife until he had a heart attack and died. He was taken to the shady science group known as Project Born Again, who discovered that he had a latent mutant gene, and they resurrected him, driving him completely insane in the process. He went on a rampage before being eventually taken out and resurrected again and assigned to be a member of the superhero team Bloodstrike. Just by looking at him, the Wolverine influence is pretty clear, with the fangs, the claws, and the mask that is exactly like Wolverine's, just a different color. It always baffles me when characters that are this similar to the characters they are ripping off of are created. Like, yeah, Wolverine was huge in the 90s, but if you create a character that is this similar, don't you realize that most people are just gonna be like, man, I'd rather just go buy a Wolverine comic?
And number 10, Cyberforce. Cyberforce has to be one of the biggest ripoffs of the X-Men that I've ever seen. They also are likely inspired by X-Force though, based on their team dynamic and their team name, so a little bit of like an X-Men X-Force. I would say both of those things kind of come together here. Cyberforce was a group of mutants who also ended up captured by Cyber Data. Almost all, if not literally all of the team members, bear extremely strong resemblances to the X-Men mutants, which contributed to the series getting some serious flack in terms of it being kind of a copycat of Marvel's X-Men. However, it did differ in regards to some key elements. While X-Men was more targeted towards being family friendly, as many of Marvel's comics generally have been throughout the years, well except for maybe lines like Max and to an extent I would say Ultimate, Cyberforce did not shy away from pushing the boundaries of, let's say, teen related content, and this also got them some flack among certain circles when it came to critiques of the series and the team as well. Cyberforce is a team and series that originated at Image Comics in partnership with Malibu Comics. The team was created by Mark Silvestri and would eventually move over to Top Cow Productions, which is actually his own publisher, so yeah, Cyberforce. And friends, if you love what we do here on Top 10 Nerd and you love when we talk about things that are mutant adjacent, mutant related, or just mutants in general, be sure to let us know by clicking that subscribe button. Number 9, Ripclaw. I wonder who that could be a ripoff of. If you guessed another very famous Marvel superhero mutant with claws that is known by the code name of Wolverine, you'd be right, bub. Ripclaw was one of the few members of the team to actually withstand the test of time, being one of the most famous and long-lasting even after Cyberforce began to fade. Despite his team losing prominence, Ripclaw would end up continuing to guest star, showing up in other series like Silvestri's The Darkness. He's also had his own short solo series as well for a bit. Ripclaw differs from Wolverine slightly in the fact that he has ties to the native peoples of America, with it being believed he may belong originally to the Apache tribe, although he also seems to have ties to the Navajo, the Lakota Sioux, and the Cheyenne as well. Like Wolverine, he also has experience and a background in the martial arts as well. Ripclaw possesses cybernetic claw enhancements that are similar to Marvel's Deathstrike. They're actually claws that are part of his fingernails, allowing his fingernails to extend and become razor sharp. In addition addition to that, he also has superhuman senses, strength, and a healing factor. Number 8. Wildcats. Wildcats is a team created by Jim Lee and Brandon Choi for Image Comics, during a period when many creators were actually working with Image because they sought to own their own properties and ideas, which the big two were pretty opposed to at that time, and I mean, honestly still are today. Wildcats actually became so popular that despite the fact that DC did not want to let creators like Jim Lee own their creations and believed that it was actually the brand and staple characters that sold comics, not the creators behind said characters and narratives, they would later approach Lee to offer a sum for ownership of the Wildcats and his Wildstorm universe, so that DC could take over the publishing of both. Wow. When it comes to this team, it's easy to see the influence of Marvel's X-Men, just even when we look at its creator, Jim Lee's history. Lee is also known for his amazing art, and despite being now heavily integrated with DC Comics, is also no stranger to Marvel, having been one of the people behind one of the most famous and iconic runs, the 90s X-Men run, which featured art by Jim Lee throughout. In Wildcats, we follow a team of superpowered beings, known as half-breeds, who are the result of aliens coming to Earth and known as the Cherubim, and mating with humans. The conflict of the comic pits the Cherubim and their offspring against the Daemonites, another alien race they have been warring with for centuries. Number 7. Grifter. Cole Cash has some distinct differences, but also a lot of distinct similarities, I would say, at the same time, to another very famous and prominent X-Man that you are likely familiar with. Gambit. Grifter is Cole Cash, a literal grifter in terms of his backstory and origin from a young age. Not only does he have a history as a con man, but while having a shady past, he also appears to genuinely want to save and help people he deems innocent. Sort of like a thief with a heart of gold. Sound like, anyone you already know? Grifter has had psionic powers in the past, but is also known for his skills as a marksman, generally wielding 2 guns or using throwing weapons in combat. So yeah, he might not have the exact power set of Gambit, he doesn't like throw cards and they explode, but the whole, throwing things element of his abilities definitely seems to fit the bill otherwise. And I mean, I feel like even his look is very Gambit-esque. Number 6. Umbrella Academy. The Umbrella Academy was definitely influenced and inspired by other similar teams that came before, like the X-Men, there's no doubt there. But there are also elements of Hellboy in there as well, which is pretty cool, especially with how oddball the comic series, its characters, and the show inspired by the comics can be. Umbrella Academy and its creation, however, was also influenced by Gerard Way's experience with the band My Chemical Romance, and his time on tour. For those of you that don't know, Gerard Way is the person that created the Umbrella Academy, so fun facts. In fact, many of the Hargreaves are actually inspired by his bandmates themselves, who of course quickly become like your family when you spend so much time together with them and, especially when you're on tour. The Umbrella Academy is the story of a group of superpowered individuals who were adopted by Sir Reginald Hargreaves after their mysterious births, which all happened on the same day all over the world. Reginald recruited them to create his own superhero team, raising them and training them to hone their skills and master them over time. However, his plan was only met with, I would say, a modicum of success, and eventually the Umbrella Academy would disband. However, years later, they would come together again after the possibly mysterious death of their adoptive father and would be forced to reunite in order to prevent the end of the world. Number 5. Allison Hargreaves. Allison Hargreaves is maybe one of the most original feeling ripoffs that I've listed here in terms of, individual characters we're talking about, but still, she does seem to take a lot of inspiration from one very prominent X-Men character, Jean Grey. As a child, I would say Allison especially resembles Jean in the comics, with her hair appearing red as opposed to her standard purple that we're used to seeing her have when she's an adult. And with purple hair, you could use that to link her to another famous telepathic or psionic character, Psylocke, aka Betsy Braddock, and also aka Quanon, depending on what we're talking about, and even if they're combined, that's a whole thing. Sometimes separate, sometimes tragically combined, I would say. Allison Hargreaves is known by the codename of Rumor. This is because she can use her powers to influence the will of others by using the phrase, "I heard a rumor." While Jean and Psylocke don't typically use their powers in this way, Jean is definitely capable of controlling people and influencing them and their minds using her own abilities, and I would also say so is Psylocke to a perhaps a lesser extent, but still is a thing that she could do. Although her psionic abilities tend to be more used in direct combat, where she can deal mental damage using psi weapons, because that's what Psylocke likes to do. Number 4. Next Men. The X-Men definitely were inspired by the X-Men. There's no doubt about that in my mind at all. They were a creation of John Byrne's for Dark Horse Comics, and of course John Byrne is also a writer who has a history of, being tied to the X-Men as well. These superpowered beings were more anti-heroes than straight-up heroes who attempt to rescue a world that they really don't know a lot about, having been raised in a virtual reality world inside a lab. In other words, they kind of, to me, share some similarities to our friend Phantom X. The X-Men also have some other interesting elements when it comes to how they were presented in contrast to the X-Men. Byrne tried to ground them and their abilities a little bit more in reality by making pretty much every superpower that they have come with some kind of quirk or some kind of setback in some way, trying to acknowledge some of the real world consequences one might actually have to deal with physically or mentally as a result of having superpowers. Because usually when you have superpowers, it's like you have super strength and it's not a problem for your body, but then there are other characters that have super strength in other worlds where it's like, okay, they're super strong, but they're not super durable, which seems like how powers would probably go, and then you just mess yourself up by using your super strength. Number 3, Nathan. Nathan of the X-Men is definitely a ripoff of Cyclops, but something that I think is actually really interesting is he isn't a direct one-for-one copy. His powers are actually, in a way, kind of like the opposite of Scott's, or at least an alternative, if not, the direct opposite to Scott's powers. They're not really the direct opposite, but they work in a very different way, but something that kind of feels like the opposite. Let me explain. While Nathan can also be spotted wearing shades with even a similar hairstyle, I'd say to Scott's, his powers allow him to see everything extremely well. Instead of expelling optic blasts from his eyes are more like great receptors for light, meaning that he can see things most people can't. Nathan, like Scott though, is also known for being the team leader of the X-Men, so yeah, they definitely are meant to be kind of like parallels of each other, but I do like that Byrne decided to give us a very different kind of eye related mutation here. Also, this power set kind of makes me think of Eye-Boy, who I don't think was created yet when X-Men first appeared. I'm pretty sure they appeared in the 90s or the 80s. Eye-Boy didn't come out until the 2000s, so it is possible that Nathan, who was definitely inspired by Psyche, may have also influenced the creation of other X-Men like Eye-Boy, who appeared over at Marvel after Nathan's first appearance in X-Men over at Dark Horse, which is pretty neat actually. Number 2, G-Men. Before we even get X-Men in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we're probably likely going to get X-Men copycats in the streaming series universe based off of Garth Ennis's The Boys. The G-Men are a villainous team inspired by the X-Men, who are another group of kind of Vought-endorsed heroes. At least I think they're Vought-endorsed. I haven't read all of The Boys, so I apologize if I'm incorrect about that one. And unsurprisingly, it's also believed that they'll be linked to Payback when they arrive in the live-action series of its own universe. Payback, for those who may not be aware, are basically The Boys' version of Marvel's Avengers in the comics, with their leader being a parody-inspired version of Captain America there, known as Soldier Boy, although they kind of went a different way with it a little bit in the live-action series. G-Men are led by John Godolkin, whose team were all kidnapped when they were younger and raised and trained by him in his own school. The name G-Men likely comes from his last name, Godolkin, but can also be a slang term used with negative connotation to indicate those working for the government. G-Men, government men. So that name kind of has a double meaning, and also it just basically means, yeah, they're not very good people. Surprise, surprise. Number 1, John Godolkin. If you thought Professor X was bad, wait till you meet his boys equivalent, which of course is way worse. The founder of the G-Men and its other spin-off teams is John Godolkin. In The Boys, Godolkin has done a lot of awful things to his superpowered students, many of them I cannot even mention on YouTube because they're just that bad and kind of goes against TOS. Unlike Charles Xavier though, Godolkin has no powers to speak of, being more similar to Niles Calder, I would say, from DC in that regard, who is in essence the head of their version of an off-kilter outcast hero team known as the Doom Patrol. Doom Patrol, in fact, is not a ripoff of the X-Men, if you're wondering why I didn't list them here, as their existence actually predates the X-Men by a few months in terms of the comic's release. Godolkin ended up capturing his team members as opposed to offering them a place at his school, taking them kinda against their will. He specifically, however, seeks out runaways and orphans, which, to be honest, so kind of does Charles. So, although some of Xavier's students do admittedly come from happy, healthy families that simply basically simply chose to admit their children to his school to be trained in the use of their powers. So I would say, that could be a difference.
But in at number 10 is Darkwing. Starting off this list with an extremely short-lived, obvious, and purposely on-the-nose knockoff of the Dark Knight is Darkwing from the Image Comics Invincible series. When we kick off that story, the world is defended by the Guardians of the Globe, an elite group of heroes who were very obviously based on the Justice League of America. The team was composed of the Immortal, who was similar to but inherently different than Superman, Red Rush, who was based on the Flash, Aquarius, who was based on Aquaman, Martian Man based on Martian Manhunter, the Green Ghost based on Green Lantern, and the two financiers of the team, War Woman based on Wonder Woman, and of course, Darkwing. Obviously, being one of the members who funded the team, Darkwing was incredibly wealthy. He was all dark and brooding, he wore a cape, he was in peak human condition, he relied on tech and his hand-to-hand combat skills, and he had cool one-liners. And none of that saved him from his very sudden sticky end. Number 9. Captain Sunshine. Captain Sunshine of the long-running Venture Bros animation series, while absolutely superpowered and brightly dressed, is such an obvious parody of Batman, and even more specifically, Batman Beyond. The current Captain Sunshine, Chuck Scarsdale, was actually the former sidekick called Wonder Boy of the original hero Desmond, who is now hella old and essentially acts as the Alfred to Chuck. This is extremely similar to how in Batman Beyond, Bruce Wayne becomes the mentor and guy in the chair to Terry McGinnis, who is the new Batman. But Venture Bros goes beyond all the other Batman knockoffs on this list by getting the actual voice of Batman, the late Kevin Conroy, to be the voice of Captain Sunshine. Actually, side note, if we're talking about Batman ripoffs voiced by Batmen, Adam West also did the voice of Catman on The Fairly Odd Parents, so that's a little fun fact for you. And moving on to number 8, Rorschach. Now look, there is indeed another Watchman that embodies Batman in some much less subtle ways. In fact, almost all the characters from Watchmen are a parody of another hero or villain from comic books in some way or form. The whole Watchmen story was made to deconstruct and satirize the idea of superheroes and to make a political commentary. Now while Rorschach himself was very obviously modeled after the Question, he is a much more gritty and brutal character who lives by such an extreme sense of justice that it makes me, and a lot of other people, believe that Rorschach's character is likely what would happen to Batman if he was real, or if he just went a little bit off the deep end. He is a hero that you root for, but you almost feel as though you shouldn't because of his anarchist ways, and while that is not exactly Batman, the grizzled ordinary man with a dark past who is a masked detective who sneaks into crime scenes and beats criminals to a pulp in the middle of the night, that's got Batman written all over it. Number 7. Night Owl. With that said about Rorschach, we might as well talk about the much more obvious knockoff of Batman from the Watchmen comics, Night Owl. Just looking at Night Owl, you know he is meant to inspire the idea of Batman. Also, if you know DC Comics well enough, you probably know about Earth 3's Batman, aka Owlman or Thomas Wayne Jr., and the physical similarities there are obviously even more apparent. But Night Owl is actually intended to be a parallel of Blue Beetle, which may surprise you, but it's because of the inherited nature of the Night Owl name, the same way there have been multiple Blue Beetles. But Dan Drayberg is wealthy thanks to his inheritance, he's a regular guy, he has an underground lair, he's incredibly intelligent, creating owl-themed vehicles. The source of his power is almost entirely reliant on his technology, and his fighting style focuses more on incapacitation over the violence used by some other heroes. But man, he is pretty damn mopey like all the time, which does kind of line up with Batman, but never this much. Number 6. Nemesis. Mark Miller, not to be confused with Frank Miller, which is something I do all the time, created Nemesis with the whole idea of what would happen if you took Batman but did everything completely different. Essentially, it asks what happens if Bruce Wayne used his wealth and resources to become a villain instead of a hero. The smartest man in the world, as the only supervillain in the world, with vendetta against police in all countries and a revenge for a lost childhood. Now, we gotta say, it doesn't quite hit the mark you might think. It's not exactly the greatest comic book. It kinda relies on shock factor and overabundance of the overtop violence just for the sake of it, and of course the opposition to the character of Batman. But that makes Nemesis perfect for this list. He wears all white, has a super crazy cool cave, and relies on his tools, subtlety, and his massive intellect. I almost wish it was better, but unfortunately centering the comic around an evil, cocky Batman who isn't really that likable it didn't work out too well. Number 5. Nighthawk. In 1996, Marvel created a whole team of villains who were direct knockoffs of DC Comics' Justice League with the Squadron Sinister. This team was created by the Grand Master after coming into contact with a team called the Squadron Supreme, who came from a different universe. The Squadron Supreme had direct Marvel versions of heroes like Superman with Hyperion, Wonder Woman with Power Princess, and among others, Batman with Nighthawk, aka Kyle Richmond. Kyle Richmond is a multi-billionaire whose riches were built through his father's criminal enterprises, leading him to choose to use the money for good instead of evil. He's got a cape, he has pointy ears, he's animal themed, and no matter which version we are talking about, the character is incredibly brooding and runs around at night. There are at least 5 well-known versions of Kyle Richmond in the Marvel Universe. The Squadron Sinister one, who eventually joins the Defenders, the Earth 712 Squadron Supreme version, the Earth 31916 Kyle Richmond, who was a black man whose parents were taken out by white supremacists, leading him to become an anti-racism vigilante, the Iron Man-like Ultimate Universe Kyle Richmond, and the Kyle Richmond of Earth TRN 852, which is not a regular part of the multiverse, but a magical creation of the villain Mephisto, where the Avengers never existed. Also, you have to call me Nighthawk. I just want to say that. Number 4. Big Daddy. Another creation of Mark Miller, not Frank Miller. Big Daddy appeared in the Kick-Ass comics and the movies, and speaking of the movies, in them, he looks like an exact replica of Batman, but he acts a lot more like the Punisher, meaning he is heavily armed and not afraid to use those arms at all. That's also the case in the comics, but here he has a completely different costume that does not reflect Batman. But he is still a knockoff of Batman for one big reason: Hit Girl. Hit Girl is actually Big Daddy's daughter, who he trained to become an incredibly capable assassin and sidekick, and this is a lot like Batman and Robin. Initially, we are led to believe that Big Daddy did this for revenge against a mob boss who caused the passing of his wife, but over time, we learned that was actually all a lie. His wife was very much alive, and he practically took his daughter and went off on the run, training her and going on missions with her, all to give her an exciting life, funding the whole thing by selling comic books and looting criminals. It's a really interesting idea of taking someone and manipulating and turning them into a crime-fighting sidekick, which is arguably something Batman does all the time. Number 3. Moon Knight. Originally, Marvel's Moon Knight did start as a Batman takeoff in the panels of Werewolf by Night, but good golly, he has become so much more, and I think I can speak for almost everyone when I say, thank the Lord he has. But since this is a Batman knockoff list, let's talk about what these two characters share. They both run around in the night as Knights of the Night, and that was fun to say. Both of these characters are very wealthy, and they use that wealth to fund their crime-fighting ways. They both wear capes, utilize themed tools, and they're both, on the surface, messed up psychologically, and that's kind of where the similarities stop. Talking about psychology, Moon Knight is way more distorted than the Caped Crusader. Almost all of his stories revolve around him struggling with his sanity and multiple personalities, and the rest of the superheroes know how insane he is. And then there's his backstory. Moon Knight was a mercenary who, at the end of his mortal coil, was chosen by an Egyptian god to be its avatar, which granted him super strength, durability, stamina, self-sustenance, immortality, and divine mystical empowerment. I think on the surface, it's easy to draw parallels between Moon Knight and the Dark Knight, but on the surface only. Number 2. Midnighter. Hailing from the Wildstorm universe, which is now under the DC's purview, Midnighter is one of the founding members of the Authority, which is a team just like the Justice League yet again, only I think I find this team to be less of a parody and more of a legit thing of their own. The Authority are actually really cool, and I'm super pumped that we will be getting them in the DCEU. Midnighter goes hand in hand with his partner and husband, Apollo, and together they are very clear nods to Batman and Superman. Now, obviously, in order for them to work as their own heroes, things have to differ a little bit. For Midnighter, while he dresses in all black, is incredibly stealthy, is an unmatched hand-to-hand fighter, and utilizes tech, he is incredibly violent, which is a huge no-no for Batman. I'm talking almost Punisher levels of violence. He also has actual superpowers. His main one is battle precognition, which allows him to predict how a situation will happen before it starts, running through a given situation millions of times in his mind before the first move is even made. All of his major senses are incredibly enhanced as well, and thanks to a series of crazy implants, he has super strength, speed, durability, reflexes, control over his pain receptors, environmental adaptation, and an insanely good healing factor. And in at number 1 is Darkwing Duck. He is the terror that flaps in the night. He is the awkward goodbye that lasts way too long. He is Darkwing Duck. Darkwing Duck, especially in the comics, is like the Tim Burton Batman movies fused together with Donald Duck. And then, to keep things not entirely a ripoff, there are dashes of pulp comics and Golden Age heroes like Dick Tracy and the Shadow, the Sandman, Doc Savage, the Green Hornet, the Flash, the Lone Ranger, and even Zorro. The fictional city of St. Canard is a direct parody of Gotham City, but what makes the whole thing just so much better is the whole screwball mentality of Disney's Talking Ducks. The show ran for 3 seasons from 1991 to 1992 and tells the adventures of Darkwing Duck, aided by his sidekick and pilot Launchpad McQuack. In his secret identity of Drake Mallard, which is a direct parody of Kent Allard, the altered ego of the Shadow, he lives in an unassuming suburban house with his adopted daughter Gosalyn, with his whole struggle being to balance his ego against his desire to be a good father to Gosalyn and to help do good in St. Canard City, which is a parody of Gotham City, like I already said. Yes, it is a parody, so it's openly being like, we're ripping off Batman, but it's for comedy, which makes it totally okay.
Number 10. X-Men. While I love the X-Men, and of course you all know this I imagine, I cannot deny that they were predated by DC's own Doom Patrol. In fact, one of the creators of Doom Patrol, Arnold Drake, even confessed later in his life that he did in fact think that Marvel could have stolen the idea for their X-Men from DC, directly being inspired by what DC was planning to do with Doom Patrol. While earlier on in his life, Drake was initially a little bit more dismissive of the idea that Jack Kirby and Stan Lee over at Marvel had been inspired by Doom Patrol due to the fact that X-Men came out, only a few months after. He later reflected and changed his tune. This was because at the time, the Marvel method was in full swing, which actually made it easier and faster for Marvel to churn out comics. The Marvel method has been considered controversial, to say the least, among many working in the industry and among fans, as people wonder about the true balance in the collaboration between artists and writers who use that method. The Marvel method involves a writer coming up with a story summary, pitching it to their artist, who then takes the summary and then creates the visuals of the comic, drawing it as they imagine the story to unfold without a specific panel-by-panel script as their guide. They leave notes for the writer and then pass back their work to the writer, who basically finishes the comic by filling in the dialogue. In some cases, we even now know that writers' dialogue was taken almost directly from artists' notes as well. However, no matter how controversial it is today, the Marvel method made the process of creating comics faster. And this, in addition to the fact that many writers and artists went back and forth between the big 2 publishers of DC and Marvel back in the day, and still do now to be honest, made Arnold Drake wary that someone actually could have shared the idea of Doom Patrol that they'd perhaps overheard at DC to Stan Lee over at Marvel. With the Marvel method in full swing, the comic could then have been easily made quickly enough to be released just shortly after Doom Patrol's release itself. At least, that's the theory. And friends, before we move on to our next spot on this list, if you love what we do here at Top 10 Nerd, if you love these cool sleeves that I'm wearing today, be sure to let us know you love us by clicking that subscribe. I mean, you don't want to miss when we all wear cool sleeves, Number 9. Norman Osborn / Green Goblin. Norman Osborn is one of my favorite villains in all of Marvel Comics, but is he completely original? While there isn't one specific DC character that is quite like him, I would say, there might be 2 that could be combined together and in doing so have inspired his creation. That is both Lex Luthor, who bears some resemblance in terms of his characterization to Norman, and the Joker, who bears some resemblance to Norman's Green Goblin persona. While Lex and the Joker both made their first appearances back in the 1940s over at DC Comics, Green Goblin, like Spider-Man, the superhero he is most often attached to, would not appear until the 1960s. Number 8. Sentry. I mean, I think you know where I'm going with this one. Sentry is basically a ripoff of Superman. But that being said, Robert Reynolds is also unique in the sense that he provides a sort of fresh take on this characterization. While Superman is all-powerful, an alien from another world that he was too young to really ever know, Bob is a human, just a straight-up human, who initially thought he was chosen for a specific soldier serum type program to become a hero. In reality though, he was a man with many personal demons who ended up breaking into a laboratory late one night, hoping to find something, and ended up taking the Golden Sentry serum, which granted him the power of 1 million suns. Sentry, however, has a darker half that came with him, a supervillain known as the Void, and so for years, humanity and Bob himself was made to basically forget that he ever existed. That's how you know you are powerful enough to be on Soup's level, when being retconned because the danger you pose is actually written into your own story. Number 7. Ant-Man. Ant-Man technically is a copy of DC's Atom. At least, that's how he started out anyways, and that's how some people see it. Over the years, Ant-Man has grown though a lot as a character, and I mean a lot. Well, and I mean, now he's gone, so rest in peace, Hank. And while Ray Palmer and Hank Pym may have started out as similar in terms of their abilities, their journeys, I would say, have been very different. I could get into all of it, but honestly, I mean, that could be a whole list all its own because they both have some really cool histories. So I'll just leave it with this. Atom came out during a time when comics were desperate to once more hold the attention of readers, and science at that time was all the rage. Both were inspired by the field of science because of this, belonging to a whole era of basically science-based heroes and villains. Atom could shrink and so could Ant-Man, but they both use their powers somewhat differently. Both were members of premier superhero teams, with Ant-Man being a founding member of the Avengers and Atom joining the Justice League, but both also had different approaches to what their roles were on said teams. Number 6. Black Cat. Black Cat. I wonder who she was inspired by. Many for years have called Felicia Hardy a ripoff of Catwoman, and I mean, you look at them together, I get it. It makes sense when you look at the comic book history, with Catwoman appearing decades earlier and both sharing multiple similarities. Namely that they are both romantic interests of masked vigilantes who also have a criminal history. Felicia herself is a cat burglar who dresses up in a cat suit and has a cat themed name. She even sometimes has claws. Catwoman is also a cat burglar known for her skills as a thief and her dexterous abilities. She too dresses up in a cat inspired outfit during her capers, I would say even a little bit more so. Both have also acted as thieves and villains, but also played the role of hero and anti-hero, teaming up with their own lovers who tend to be heroes themselves, Batman and Spider-Man. And both are iconic characters, staples each in their own self-contained universes. However, despite all these similarities, Marv Wolfman, who created Felicia Hardy, did claim that he was actually inspired not by a comic book character from the 1940s, not by Catwoman, but instead a cartoon cat character from the 1940s known simply as Black Cat, a straight up cat, who caused those around them to experience bad luck simply with their presence. The cat in question is from the 1949 cartoon Bad Luck Blackie, and the cat's power set, I will say, does line up with one Felicia eventually was confirmed to have. However, I would still say that Catwoman does seem to, at least at this point, if not right from the beginning, have influenced Black Cat's evolution over the years. I mean, I don't think we can deny that. I understand what people are saying, and I want to trust creators of characters, but I think now, maybe, there might have been some influence. Perhaps. Number 5. Eternals. New Gods and Eternals is a comparison that is as old as time. As old as the gods, some might say. Why does this exist? Why do we compare these two? Well, this is because the Eternals came after the New Gods, and they are both, god-based groups who are known for their sheer power. But more importantly, it's because they share a creator who definitely was inspired by his own creations, including the New Gods when he created the Eternals, and their mythos for Marvel. That creator is none other than the legendary Jack Kirby. The story of the Eternals creation is pretty interesting too. It was basically Jack Kirby's way of continuing his story with a new creation. You see, he wrote New Gods for DC, but when he couldn't get enough creative control from that publisher, ultimately left to go back to Marvel, creating for them his and their Eternals. Number 4. Hyperion. If you thought Sentry seemed to be heavily inspired by DC Superman, wait until you meet Hyperion. Hyperion is literally a straight up Superman copy. Hyperion is actually an alien from another world and in the Marvel universe, also generally from another universe entirely. Like Superman, he also arrived on Earth when he was only a baby, also hailing from a world that had recently been completely destroyed, making him the last known survivor. Also like Superman, he is insanely strong, can survive in the vacuum of space, is also insanely fast, durable, has a healing factor, super hearing, and even atomic vision. Now, atomic vision is basically heat vision, so. Also, Hyperion was basically made to be, a bit of a commentary on Superman, so obviously he's inspired by him. Number 3, Deadpool. Deadpool is actually one of my favorite Marvel characters, but even I can admit that he is a direct ripoff of DC's Deathstroke. Although, I will add, the thing I really love about Wade Wilson is that he is a straight up parody of Slade Wilson. So at least he provides some interesting commentary as opposed to just being like a direct one-for-one copy. Where Slade is often shown as being extremely serious and one of the most deadly assassins in the world, Wade is often shown as being pretty ridiculous, and while skilled, is not actually known as much for his abilities as an assassin, but is more deadly thanks to his relentless healing factor, and often thanks to some good old dumb luck. And I mean, both these guys also share healing factors, so yeah. And if you don't think, if you're like, how dare you say that about Deadpool, he is so insanely skilled, I mean, friends. We all saw what happened when Deadpool was cured of his healing factor and made handsome again and quite mortal again, and he was super rusty when it came to his skills after becoming reliant on his powers for years. His lack of familiarity with dodging damage was shown to have made him kinda sloppy as a mercenary, to be honest with you. I don't think that makes him a bad character. It's not a diss, it's just a fact. Number 2, Power Princess. Power Princess is Zarda Shelton. She has had a few different prominent versions throughout the years. There's kind of a few different alternate versions of her in the Marvel Universe, but in general, her story tends to involve her being a princess who hails from Utopia Island. Don't really think I even need to say much more. I mean, just look at her. She's definitely inspired by Princess Diana for sure. Zarda even has her own Steve Trevor in the form of Howard Shelton, who of course she ends up settling down with. He ends up running into Zarda after the boat he is on is shipwrecked. He tells her of the outside world as he is an American soldier and currently serving in World War II. Enough said? I think so. Number 1, Winter Soldier. Okay, so before you jump all over me for this one, I acknowledge that Jason Todd's appearance as Red Hood happened after Bucky Barnes returned as Winter Soldier, but I would also like to tell you the intended story behind Hush. The story that Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee had been building for issues, that in issue number 617 of Batman saw Hush revealed as Jason Todd. Dun dun dun! This was actually Loeb's initial plan for this story. He had been working towards that ending for some time, but there was an issue with it. He went online and he noticed that all the fans were guessing, and correctly so, that the reveal for Hush would give us Jason Todd, returning Todd to life after years of being dead. Loeb was basically disappointed that so many fans were able to anticipate the story's ending, and so he decided at the last minute to basically change it. In the finale, we learned that despite Hush being revealed as Jason Todd previously, this was actually Clayface disguising himself as Jason, not as part of his own plot, but as part of the true Hush's plot. And who is the true Hush? Well, I'm sure you know that. Thomas Elliot, Batman's old childhood friend. Yeah, so in other words, DC really came up with the idea of the return of a long dead character and heroic sidekick who then is twisted and turned evil first, but they just chose to change it at the last second. In fact, when Jason did inevitably end up returning as the Red Hood, he re-retconned his appearance in Hush to being somewhat legit, instead explaining that the one fighting Batman disguised as Hush, who was revealed to be Jason, was actually him, but then Jason had basically simply swapped out with Clayface, all in order to, I don't know, I guess mess with Batman? Oh boy. Yeah, I'm pretty sure Jeff Loeb later was like, maybe I should have just stuck with that. Oops.